So the title of our presentation is a question: are ants nomic insects? The author are Andrea Loi, Donato Grasso, who is a myrmecologist from the University of Parma, and me. I would like to start from the words of Jacob von Uexküll. If any man wishes to cling to the belief that all living things are nothing but machines, let him give up hope of ever catching a glimpse of those interesting individual words. I think they are aspiring words. So now we are talking about this emerging perspective, ethology of normativity. You can see some paper, the paper of Christine in normativity, my paper on animal norm, the paper of Laura Danon, animal normativity, and the paper of France Deval on natural normativity, published in the last 5 years. It is important to note that investigation of animal normativity has so far mainly focused on mammals and in particular on non-human primates and cetaceans. The present talk aims to extend this research to the world of invertebrates as well, and more specifically to investigate the world of insects. In particular, for an ethological study of norms and normativity, it would be very interesting to investigate whether there are traces, use of normativity or proto-normativity in the lives of those insects that live in societies, such as ants, termites, bees, and wasps, those insects that have been called social insects for at least a century. The idea of social insect goes back to William Morton Wheeler, author of Social Life Among the Insects, 1923, and the Social Insects, The Origin and Evolution, 1928. So a preliminary definition: what are social insects? Social or eusocial insects are thus insects that live in communities and or colonies characterized by a strong social order. These are highly complex and self-organized societies characterized, for example, by a precise division of labor. Quotation of Wilson, big expert of ants. These insects can be distinguished as a group by their common possession of 3 traits: individuals of the same species cooperating, caring for the young. There's a reproductive division of labor with more or less sterile individuals working on behalf of fecund nest mates. There is an overlap of at least 2 generations in life stages capable of contributing to colony labors so that offspring assist parents during some period of their life. Right? It's important to underline the existence of ants' cognitive capacity. Ants are endowed with important cognitive capacity. Ruth Millikan would call them conceptual capacity. For example, Paul Dobler and Wilson write, the social insects distinguish members of their own nest from those of other colonies by using receptors located on their antennae, thanks to which they perceive the hydrocarbons in the outer layer of their rigid cuticles. They also use different mixture of these chemical to identify individuals in their own nest belonging to different categories: castes, life stages, and ages. So there is a growing field in cognitive ethology, the social insects cognition. You can see some interesting paper about this topic. So have excellent learning abilities, display personality traits, individual and social, and even self-control abilities. So there are papers on this test. Recent cognitive ethology research also shows that social insects are able to have a sense of number and cognitively process identity and different relationships between sensory stimuli. Okay.
It is therefore interesting to ask ourselves whether invertebrates also possess a minimal normative cognition. But why should we study social insects in particular? The idea here is that in social insect societies, we can find mechanisms for the formation, for the development and maintenance of a strong social order. So the problem of social order leads to the study of the evolutionary origins of social norms, or the evolutionary precursors of social normativity. And so the concept of the social insect is particularly important for the investigation of normativity in the invertebrate world, because it has generally been argued that if there is a society and a particular social order, there must be necessarily a normative order that makes this social order possible. And specific to animal societies, this thesis has been formulated, for example, by Friedrich von Hayek, in Italy by Rodolfo Sacco. And indeed, Sacco and Hayek seem to suggest that social animals are by their nature necessarily nomic animals, so animals that follow rules. For example, Hayek writes that a society of animals or men is always a number of individuals observing such common rules of conduct as in the circumstances in which they live will produce an order of action. So the problem here is this really the case when we are speaking about social insects, when we are speaking about ants? Does what Hayek and Sacco claim also apply to insects? We can then ask ourselves, is there room for norms and normativity in the social world of social insects? In other words, are there nomic insects? So insects whose behavior is regulated by norms. And one of the few exceptions in the is the German philosopher of science, Martin Pusch, because at the state of the art of the scientific literature, this question has not been really asked. And one of the exceptions is this philosopher, this German philosopher, who denies that there is any room for normativity in the social world of ants. And the perspective of Pusch seems to imply at least three things. Firstly, the impossibility of a private normativity. Secondly, that the fact that normative thinking is a conceptual phenomenon, and thirdly, it seems to be a cultural phenomenon, and thus not something that can be innate. So, in order to contribute to the question of whether ants are nomic insects, so animal capable of acting in the light of norms, we will search for clues of normativity in the social world of those insects. And so we will examine three different contexts in which ethologists use deontic language, or normative language. And here the idea is that in order to identify possible clues of normativity, it is first necessary to turn to the language which is currently used by ethologists. And the first example is this by Enicke and the other authors. They speak of rules in the traffic behavior of ants. They say, whereas human traffic is regulated by a series of strict rules designed by some legislation, we hypothesize ants to have simple rules of traffic regulation as well, shaped by natural selection. Indeed, we expect self-organized mechanisms to be prime drivers, since many complex patterns in other societies are driven as emergent properties of a few very simple rules. And another example is this by Strombaum and other authors. They speak of priority rules, like cutting ends. They say an unladen particle does not attempt to pass a laden particle ahead of it. Instead, it stops and waits until the laden end has moved forward enough for it to take another step. Or another rule they explicitly formulate is that an outbound particle stops and gives way to a laden particle, and potentially a number of unladen particles following the laden particle, and so on. And here, one interesting thing is that about this quotation is that here the ethologists are talking about particles and not ends, because ethologists often use artificial simulation tools of insect behavior to test their hypotheses. So when they speak of particles, they are speaking of simulated artificial agents that serve to model the real behavior of real ants. This is an interesting problem. Another case is the use of the concept of rule in the analysis of the behavior of building structures. They speak of Reid and other authors. They speak here of ants using simple interaction rules. These ants construct complex bridges from their own bodies to span forest floor gaps. This is another really interesting use of the concept of rule. And another paper speaks of formulate another rules which are supposedly followed by ants. They say we found ants follow 3 rules which yielded accurate prediction for raft growth rate, and the raft is the structure which is being built by the ants here. And they formulate these rules. They say these rules are as follows. And for example, do not move if ants are on top of you, or if atop other ants, repeatedly move a short distance in a random direction, and so on. And another case is the use of the term of the concept rule in the case of the analysis of allocation of work. Here, Deborah Gordon, an important myrmecologist, says that each ant uses a set of rules, such as I'm a forager, and if I meet a returning patroller every so often, I remain likely to go out. And she says that evidence for such a rule is that if the forager does not meet a returning patroller, the probability it will go out diminishes. So it is certain that myrmecologists in some instances, in some cases, use deontic language to describe the social behavior of ants. They speak of ants rules with regard to ant traffic, or they speak of internal rules of ant societies. They have also spoken of punishment in ant society. And for example, it is said that in the case of a queen ant, that when she encounters a competing reproductive worker, she uses her gland to mark the worker, inducing punishment from nestmates. So here, the question is, however, whether behind this deontic language there are actual norms that regulate the social life of the anthill, or whether the use of the term rule is merely metaphorical. So the idea is that the clues of normativity in the language of ethologists may suggest clues of normativity in the real world of ants. So 2 problems open up. What do ethologists have in mind when they speak of rules? Do they take it for granted that ants are capable of following rules, or maybe is the matter more complex? And secondly, the problem of the hypothetical normative cognition in an insect. In what sense, for instance, would an ant be capable of following rules? I return the floor to Professor.
Okay. So we have some paper on this topic, and you can see in the title there is already the term rules. So we ask this question about the nature of ants' social order. Is based on norms or not? There are 2 possible answers to the question whether there are rules in the social world of ants. two hypotheses, a positive answer and a negative answer. Both answers, however, bring with them revolutionary aspects that also have repercussions for the investigation of sociality and normativity in humans and other non-human mammals. Let us now see why. A positive answer. In the event of a positive answer to the question of whether there are norms in the social world of ants, one would support the existence of norms within a society of invertebrates. So, some evolution. And in the case of a negative answer, in the event of a negative answer, we would advance the hypothesis of the existence of an anomic, non-normative animal social order, i.e. a social order without norms or rules. In this case, one would ask the classical question of sociological investigation: where does the social order in this animal society arise from? In light of the hypothesis of an anomic social order, two types of animal social order could then be distinguished. So we can distinguish these two hypotheses, so these two kinds of a social order. Anomic social order, a social order with normativity, with the norms, the classical image of a social order, but also an anomic, non-normative social order without normativity, without. So we can shift from the problem of the social order to the problem of the nature of ants behavior. And also in this case, we can distinguish two hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that the ants behavior is a normative behavior with normativity. The second is that is a kind of non-normative, anomic behavior without norm. So it's interesting about the first hypothesis, the idea of nomic behavior of ants, to see what Franz de Waal wrote in his paper Natural Normativity. The animal behavior is not free of normativity. It's hardly in need of argument. We can see this fact, this case. Take the spider's reaction to a damaged web. If the damage is extensive, she will abandon the web. But most of the time, she will go into repair mode, bringing the web back to its previous functional state, etc. Nature is full of physical structures built by animals, guided by a template of how the structure ought to look. So here, de Waal inserts the idea of a template that guides the behavior of a spider. So it's interesting, this explanation of this hypothesis of de Waal, because in this case, maybe, no, it's another hypothesis, we can speak of a nomic behavior, but without full-fledged rules, full-fledged norms. At this point, it's very interesting about the theory of or the analysis of normative or non-normative ants behavior of ants, because we can construct this tree, this diagram about the nature of ants behavior. So we can construct these different possibilities. No? We cannot try to find the right one to answer to this question, but we can just draw the possibility that we hope myrmecologists will study in the future. So, ants behavior. We have two possibilities. It's a kind of nomic behavior, a behavior with normativity, or it is not anomic. It is anomic behavior. It is not a normative behavior without normativity. So in this case, there is no space for normativity. But it's most interesting for us the first one. In this case, we can also distinguish two different possibilities. The first one we call it nomotropic behavior. Nomotropic nomic behavior. In this case, the behavior is guided by full-fledged norms or rules, like the examples that we saw described by many myrmecologists. The second possibility, the non-nomotropic nomic behavior, is the case of the val, the case of the template. We can say that in this case there is a normative behavior, but it is a normative behavior without full-fledged norms, but just a standard or a template. So a different normative entity in comparison with real full norms. Thank you.